Hi everyone. I, 29F, recently announced my pregnancy, but my mother, 52F, decided to ruin the party with her negativity and made so much fun of me that I said certain things that created a really weird environment. So, my husband and I have been married for almost 3 years. And we had been trying to conceive for about 6 months. It finally happened recently. Both of us are obviously thrilled since this was something that we had wanted for a really long time. He and I decided to throw a party to announce it to our families. We also invited a lot of our friends and coworkers, so pretty much everybody that we knew and was important to us was present at the party. I had also invited my mother, in spite of our strained relationship. A decision that I now regret. She has shown me time and again that she doesn't deserve to be around me, but I always tried to keep the peace of the family. And that's why I invited her, even though we don't have a good relationship anymore. As a matter of fact, we never had a great relationship to begin with. That was really her own fault since she had treated me really badly ever since I was a kid. She was pretty much a textbook toxic mother, constantly trying to monitor everything that I ate because she wanted me to be pretty like her. She was a model when she was younger, but she had to quit because of her pregnancy. And I guess that's where it all stemmed from, her constant obsession with turning me into a miniature version of her and living out her dreams through me. I guess you could refer to her as a combination of an almond mother and a helicopter parent. That's the most accurate description of her. Needless to say, my childhood was not an easy one and my mother was a nightmare to live with. My dad wasn't at home most of the time because he was the sole breadwinner and he would work long hours. So growing up, it was just me and my mother at home. She would make me participate in baby pageants and the sad part was that I never won a single one. I guess that's what made her even more resentful towards me, the fact that she was trying to live out her dreams through me, but even that wasn't working for her. She kept making me participate in pageants throughout my childhood, even though I never won. My mother has put me on diets from ages as young as 6 years old because she wanted me to have the perfect look and not turn out too chubby when I got older. At the time I was too young to even understand what was going on with my mother. But by the time I was in middle school, I could tell that there was something very wrong with my mother and I started rebelling. My mother would pack my lunches and I would be lucky if I got anything more than half a fruit on most days. So I started eating my friends' lunches as well. I was lucky enough to have good friends who didn't rat me out and gladly shared their lunches with me. I guess their parents also understood that my mother was kind of off, and instead of complaining about me, they started putting extra food in their kids' lunch boxes. That was really nice of them and that's how I got by in middle school. It was tough and I hated the fact that I had to count on my friends for something as basic as food, but that's how it was. But in high school, things got easier for me because I received lunch money from my dad. My mother couldn't stop him from giving me money for lunch, but she would threaten me and tell me that if I gained weight, then she would punish me by starving me at home. I honestly thought that she was joking, but unfortunately, she was not. Once I started high school, I started eating more. Since now I didn't have to rely on my friends for food and could eat to my heart's content, I did gain substantial weight, but I didn't get fat. I just became healthier because I needed that food to fuel myself. I started feeling less lethargic and weak all the time and my overall health was much better because of the weight gain. My body also started looking normal and I was really happy about it because I finally looked like how a normal teenager does instead of a stick-thin malnourished kid. But of course, my mother was horrified and would weigh me almost every day because she had noticed the weight gain way before I had, and she did not approve of it. When she realized that I wasn't losing weight, in spite of her warnings, she started doing exactly what she had promised me she would. She started starving me at home. She had to give me dinner because my dad would be home at the time, but she forced me to go to school without breakfast and hid all the snacks so I had nothing to munch on when I was at home. Essentially, the only 2 meals that I was having every day were the school lunch and dinner at home. And even though having lunch at school had helped me gain weight once, it wasn't nutritious enough to sustain that. So I started losing weight rapidly once again. It all came to a head when I actually lost consciousness during class one day and had to be taken to the ER because I just wasn't waking up. That was the day that my father finally found out about everything. Now a lot of people must be wondering why I hadn't told my father everything right from the beginning. It was obviously because of my mother and I was really scared of her. Ever since I was a little child, she had practically drilled into my head that if I ever told my dad or anybody else that I was hungry, then she would make sure that I remained hungry for the rest of my life. Saying that I was hungry in my house was pretty much the worst thing that I could say, and I was forbidden from using that word. And obviously, like any little kid, I was terrified of my mother, and I did not want to end up on her bad side. So I never spoke up against her because I was scared of what might happen if I did, and that's what stopped me. And also, maybe a strange little part of myself actually wanted my mother to love me for who I was, and I wanted her approval so bad that I never spoke up against her. My dad was also really busy all the time and I barely saw him when I was a kid. To my father, there was nothing more important than making money and he was the kind of dad who would bring the office home with him. He worked really hard and I am kind of grateful for it, since he was the reason that I had a nice life. I was miserable but I was rich. If he picked up on the fact that I was a lot skinnier than most kids my age, he never said anything about it until that day when I ended up in the ER. Both my parents were called, and while my father seemed to genuinely be concerned about me, My mother just appeared to be really annoyed. I found out later that the doctors had told my parents that my body was lacking proper nutrition and I had fainted out of hunger. They suggested that either I was actively being starved by someone or I was starving myself. Either way, my mother's cover was blown. When we got back home that day, my dad sat me down and asked me what was going on. My mother was there in the room with us, but for the first time, I didn't feel afraid of speaking up for myself. I told my father the truth and said that it was my mother who had been starving me. I also told him that this was not a recent development but had been going on ever since I was a kid and I couldn't put up with this anymore. I also mentioned that my mother had been trying to get me to participate in pageants all my life, even though I had never been interested in that field. I spilled all the beans and told my dad that she was probably trying to live vicariously through me and wanted me to become a model because that was her dream. But I couldn't handle this anymore and I was sick of being deprived of something so basic as food. I had a bit of a meltdown because I had been keeping all that to myself for about several years and now that it was finally all out in the open, I was just too overwhelmed. I started crying and my dad consoled me for a bit, then sent me up to my room and told me that I could take a nap for a bit or do something to distract myself because I was not going to be allowed to come back into the living room for quite some time. I knew then that my mother was going to hear it and I decided to clear out and shut myself in my room for the next couple of hours. Up until this day, I don't really know exactly what went down in the next couple of hours following the revelation that my mother had been starving me and that she wanted me to accomplish what she hadn't been able to. All I knew was that I kept hearing muffled, screaming and shouting from downstairs, but I knew better than to interfere. My parents got married, really young and they had been together since high school, so I rarely ever heard them fighting. But that one was vicious, and I knew it because my father never lost his temper. He would always try to work things out with my mother calmly when they would have disagreements before, but that was probably their worst fight. When I finally went downstairs after almost 3 hours of being shut in my room, I realized that things were relatively quiet, but my mother was sobbing on the couch and my dad just sat opposite her with a stone-cold look on his face. When he saw me, he told me that I didn't have to listen to my mother anymore, and neither did I have to fear her. He told me that I could eat whatever I wanted to and that I didn't have to worry about my weight as long as I was healthy. He then handed me some cash and told me to go get some pizza with my friends, which is a luxury that I hadn't been able to afford before because my mother would keep all the cash from me and would never allow me to eat out with my friends in a million years. I was thrilled and I could tell that my parents needed some more time to sort this out, so I decided to leave them to their own devices and went out with my friends instead. When I came back home, my parents were sleeping in separate rooms, but I didn't have the courage to ask either of them what exactly had happened. I don't know what my dad said to my mother or what exactly they talked about, but what I do know is that after that day, everything changed for the better. My mother stopped monitoring what I eat after that, and that was great. Unfortunately, she also stopped speaking to me at all, and that was kind of awkward because we still lived in the same house. She just didn't speak to me after that, unless it was absolutely necessary. My parents didn't get divorced or anything, but they just started sleeping in different rooms and were a lot more distant than they used to be. However, my relationship with my father started improving. In the sense that after that incident, I finally had a relationship with my dad. Before that, he was always too busy with work, but then he started making time for me. It was still difficult for me to hold a conversation with him for more than maybe 5 minutes, but it started getting better with time. That incident had taken place when I was in my sophomore year, and by the time I was in my senior year, things at home had improved considerably. My dad and I could finally talk to each other like fathers and daughters usually do. I wouldn't say that my relationship with my mother got better, but at least it didn't get any worse. She would still only speak to me whenever I was absolutely necessary and would try to avoid me otherwise, but I wasn't complaining. I had gone through enough with my mother and I just want things to be peaceful. I had obviously always wondered why my parents didn't separate, but I guess that was the personal choice. And I didn't want to question it, so I never brought it up with either of them. I'm addressing this because I know a lot of you guys are going to find it just as weird as I did, but I wanted you to know that I don't have an answer to it. The only person who would probably be able to tell you guys why they started together would be my father. But yeah, I don't know why they never got divorced. Anyway, by the time it was time for me to start college, my father and I were going great and I was actually pretty upset to be leaving him behind. The day that I left for college, my mother did wish me luck and said goodbye to me. I thought it was kind of strange because, for years before that, she had been ignoring me, and that was the first real interaction that we had. After I told my father the truth about how my mother would treat me at home. Once I went away to college, I started actively trying to keep in touch with my parents. My mother as well, because in spite of whatever had happened in the past, part of me still wanted to improve our relationship and work on it to fix it. I honestly felt like if we tried, my mother and I would probably be able to make it work. She had a lot of problems, but no person is entirely bad, and even when she was starving me, there would be times that we had a genuine love for each other. Don't get me wrong, what she did was messed up, and I don't think I would ever be able to forgive her for that. But even at that time, there would be great moments between us two, and that is probably why I had so much faith in our relationship. In the years that I was in college, my father and I kept in touch and would talk almost every other day. I tried to rebuild my relationship with my mother, but I wasn't as successful as I had hoped to be. She would barely ever talk to me, and even when she did, it felt like she was not even there or maybe just not interested enough. I kept trying, but I was also busy with assignments and my friends and stuff like that, so after a while I stopped trying to speak to my mother. I didn't even feel guilty about it because she was the one who never reciprocated my efforts. And it's crazy to think that she was the one who had ruined my childhood and yet I was the one trying to win her over. Anyway, after I graduated, I decided to move back in with my parents for a couple of months until I had saved up enough to get an apartment of my own. When I returned, things were still the same. My parents were still sleeping in different rooms and had practically turned into strangers who happened to have a life together. My mother was as quiet and indifferent as ever, and it was just so difficult for me to adapt to such a miserable existence at home after I had spent so much time in college where everyone was happy or at least trying to be happy most of the time. I couldn't take it anymore because I just wanted a normal family and I would do anything to make it happen. So a few weeks after I had moved back, I sat my parents down and told them that I couldn't stand this anymore and that I wanted to fix our family. Both of them got really awkward and uncomfortable at that point and refused to even look at me, but I powered through it. I told them that I was really looking forward to having a happy family, something that I had never had. And so I suggested family counseling. I had already been looking into it before I made the suggestion and I knew that this could really help us. They protested at first, but I talked them into it. My mother was a particularly tough nut to crack and she seemed very bent on the fact that our family was just fine the way it was and that I didn't have to go out of my way to get therapists and psychology involved here because it was simply not required. But I convinced her and told her that I was ready to put everything in the past and move on. All that I wanted her to do was give our family a chance to make everything right. It took me a while, but she came around eventually and we finally started counseling sessions as a family. And it really did help us. It didn't fix us like I hoped that it would, but it helped us all talk about a lot of things that we had been suppressing. My mother and I, especially, started talking about a lot of things that we had never thought we would talk about so openly. In therapy, she admitted that she had been trying to force her own ambitions upon me because she felt like she had failed and just wanted to be connected to the modeling world anyhow, even if it had to be through me. I acknowledged that and I forgave her and I thought that we were finally getting somewhere. My parents also started couples counseling when they realized that this was actually effective. For the couple of months that I was back at home, everything was great. And even after I moved out when I found my own apartment, things were still okay. I had actually started saying that I would now finally have a normal family, but I guess it was too much to ask for, especially from my mother. She and my father were finally working things out together in counseling and they were doing great. But for some reason, she started to sabotage her relationship with me once again, even though she had apologized for her past behavior and had forgiven her. I don't know what she was hoping to gain out of it, but now that I was an adult and she could no longer force me to keep quiet or do things that I didn't want to do, she started resorting to ridiculing me instead. It started off with digs at me about my weight even though I was at a perfectly healthy weight. Then she started talking about my appearance but tried her best to make it seem like it was coming from a place of concern. I didn't buy it even for 1 second because after spending my entire childhood being monitored by her, I knew that she was trying to do the same thing yet again. But this time she was a lot more careful and cunning about it. I told her, quite bluntly, that if she was thinking about going back to her old and trying to control me again, then she might as well stop coming to therapy with us because then that would just be a waste of time if she wasn't actually intending on bringing about any real change in her behavior. If she only wanted to make amends with me so that she could be a part of my life again to control me, then I didn't want that and we were better off separate. She tried to tell me that it was just coming from a place of concern and habit, but she promised me that she would try and keep her opinions to herself. That was several years ago, and she stayed true to her word, which is why we were able to have a relationship for this long. My parents worked things out and were back to normal after a few years of therapy and I was actually quite happy for them. Then a couple of years ago, I met my husband through work and then we started dating. So after that, it went from just being the 3 of us, to the 4 of us. My mother would still occasionally make unwelcome remarks about my weight and my appearance, but one look from either me or my dad would fix her and she would apologize instantly. I would honestly prefer if she didn't say things like that at all, but this was still better than her saying things and not being sorry for it. We were able to have a relationship for this long only because we had been actively trying to be a happy, normal family like any other. And I have to give credit where it's due, my mother really did improve with time, and even if it was just for a few years, at least I did get to experience what a normal family feels like. But then I had my pregnancy announcement party a couple of days ago and that's where everything went wrong. All thanks to my mother. For some reason, she thought that it would be hilarious to talk about my weight at the party and make it the focal point. When I announced my pregnancy, the first thing that my mother said was that now, I finally had an excuse to get fat and eat as much as I wanted to without having to worry about what she would say. She said it in a joking manner, and it got a lot of laughs, but I didn't like it. Nevertheless, I sucked it up and decided to smile through it because it was supposed to be a positive day and I didn't want to let my mother ruin it for me. But my mother didn't stop there and decided to take it further to test my patience. She went on to make a couple of more insensitive jokes about how I would soon be stuffing myself with junk food like I used to and was going to blow up like a balloon. That really got on my nerves and I don't know if it was the hormones, but I just lost it. So I decided to snap at her and said that it was bold of her to be making jokes at my expense, especially about my weight, given that she was the reason behind all my childhood trauma. That shut her up, and I knew that she was regretting all her mean jokes then. I had never spoken about my mother and her strange obsession with my eating habits outside of my household, and nobody apart from my parents and husband, nobody knew about it. But that day, I don't know what got into me, but I just snapped and started talking about it. I was quite hysterical, which I found out later from my husband, and I pretty much exposed my mother. I got so worked up that I accused her of being abusive, which she actually was, so I don't really think I did anything wrong. I had to be taken out of the room, and after my outburst, my mother was humiliated and my parents left within minutes. I did come back once I had calmed down to talk to my other guests and remedy the situation, because it was very unlike me to behave in such a way. But after I had revealed how my mother used to treat me, nobody really seemed to care about my outburst and everybody was just concerned for me, which I really appreciated. The party ended relatively quickly after that, and once everybody had cleared out, my husband told me that there was nothing wrong with the way I had reacted and that he was actually proud of me for standing up for myself and not allowing my mother to walk all over me like she was so used to in the past. I'm glad that my husband is on my side, but unfortunately, my parents are not. Of course, it's no surprise that my mother thinks that she's right and has been crying about it ever since it happened. She claims that she was just joking and that I had no right to humiliate her in front of all our guests like that. I don't understand what was so inherently wrong about what I did, because I just exposed her and at least I was honest. If she can't take it, then she probably shouldn't dish it out. If it was just my mom who thought that I overreacted, I probably wouldn't have given a second thought to it. But my father also believes that I took things way too far and that I owe her an apology. He says that my mother had already apologized and I had accepted her apologies when we were in therapy together, and I was supposed to let bygones be bygones. So my decision to bring her past treatment up in front of so many people and make her look like the villain when she was actively trying to change and had actually become a much better person now was just low and unacceptable. He told me that she was miserable and hadn't been able to stop crying ever since the party. And this is my dad we are talking about, so I'm bound to take it seriously. I did try to argue with him and tell him that my mother started it with her insensitive jokes, but he told me that maybe the jokes were alright and I was just being too sensitive. I don't really agree with that. But I don't know what to do anymore. Ida, for exposing my mother and her past treatment of me at my pregnancy announcement party over a few jokes that she made. Update 1. Hey, thank you so much for all the comments here. My husband and I have decided that we do not owe her or my father any apology and that I was perfectly in the right to expose her. I have put up with a lot and I have graciously let things go from the past, but if she's not willing to respect it, then there's not much that I can do about it. I told my father yesterday that I was not going to be apologizing to my mother, and if anything, she is the one who owes me an apology because she ruined my party. And he got really mad at me and told me that I was being overly sensitive. He told me that after my little speech at the party, nobody was willing to interact with them and the family had practically cut them off. I told him that it was not my fault, but he insisted that it was, and it turned into a full-blown argument. So now, my father and I are not on talking terms anymore. I don't know how to feel about it, but I am definitely not going to do anything to make things right this time. I tried my best in the past, and it worked, even though it was just for a while. But now I have a family of my own to think of, and I'm not going to constantly run after them to make amends. Especially when I am not even the one in the wrong in this situation. Update 2. I just realized that my mother has blocked me on all social media. I don't really know how to feel about it, but I'm not even sure that I even care. It's been a week since the party and she hasn't apologized to me. So now, she can do whatever she wants to because it's too late to make things right with me. Blocking me is not going to make me run after her, trying to apologize for things that are not my fault. Update 3. So, I have decided to block my parents everywhere and cut them off for good. It was an incredibly difficult decision to make, but I have realized that throughout my life, they have been nothing but toxic to me, and it ends now. My dad only ever did the bare minimum for me, but it just isn't going to cut it anymore. And my mom is a whole other story. The reason that they never got divorced is because they wanted to make their marriage work more than they wanted to be good parents. So they could be mad at each other, but I was always going to be the villain to them. It just sucks that my dad was only putting up an act all these years, but deep down, he was always going to pick my mother. No matter how toxic or evil she was. And my mother would always remain evil and toxic. But they can continue being the way that they are, just away from me. I guess my future is only going to meet one set of grandparents and I'm happy about it. This ends now.